The priest's hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the prayer book twice. The bride's mother wept into her handkerchief, not the soft tears mothers cry at weddings, but the desperate, choking kind. The bride's father stared at the stone floor of the church and did not lift his eyes once, not even when his daughter walked past him in her wedding dress. Every single person in that church was afraid. The organist played too fast, rushing through the hymn as if finishing it early might let him escape sooner. The witnesses stood pressed against the far wall. Even the Duke's own servants, men who had worked in his house for 20 years, kept their eyes down and their backs stiff. Everyone in that church was afraid of the Duke of Ravenhall. Everyone except the bride they were forcing him upon. Clara Hayward walked down the aisle with her chin level and her hands steady. She did not tremble. She did not cry. And when she reached the altar and looked up at the tall, dark figure waiting for her, the man half of England called a murderer, she did something no one in that church could believe. She looked him directly in the eyes. The Duke stared back at her, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Not anger, not coldness. Confusion. And that small flicker of confusion would grow, day by day, into a question that would haunt him, torment him, and keep him awake at night, until the answer finally tore his entire world apart. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back 3 weeks, to the night this all began. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas Hayward sat in the small parlor of his house with his head in his hands, and told his daughter that he had ruined them. How much? Clara asked quietly. Her father could not say the number out loud. He pushed a piece of paper across the table instead. Clara read it and felt the floor tilt beneath her. £11,000. Her father was a country doctor, a respected man, a kind man, and as it turned out, a weak man. It had started small years ago, a game of cards here, a wager there. Then his patients grew fewer, his debts grew larger, and the men he owed money to grew far less patient. "They will take the house," he whispered. "They will take everything. Clara, I could go to prison." "Then we will sell what we have and I will find work," Clara said. "I am 24 years old, father. I can teach. I can nurse. We will manage." But her father shook his head slowly, and that was when Clara noticed the second piece of paper on the table, the one he had been hiding under his arm, the one with a black wax seal pressed with the crest of a raven. "There is another way," her father said, and he could not look at her. "The debts have been bought, all of them, every last pound. One man now holds them all." "What man?" Her father's voice dropped so low she barely heard it. "The Duke of Ravenhall." The name landed in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. There was not a soul in the county who did not know that name. Mothers used it to frighten children into behaving. Servants crossed themselves when his black carriage passed on the road. Julian Thorne, the Duke of Ravenhall, lived alone in that great gray house on the hill, behind iron gates that had not opened for a ball or a dinner in 15 years. And everyone knew why. Everyone knew the story of that terrible winter night, 15 years ago, when the Duke's older brother, handsome, laughing Edmund, the heir everyone loved, went out onto the frozen lake at Ravenhall and never came back. Everyone knew that only one other person was there that night. His younger brother, Julian. Everyone knew that Julian pulled Edmund's body from the ice long after it was too late, and that when the servants found them on the shore, Julian would not speak a single word. And everyone knew what Julian gained that night. The title, the fortune, the estate, everything that had belonged to Edmund. No one ever accused him openly. There was no trial, there was no proof. There was only the story, whispered in drawing rooms and taverns for 15 years, growing darker with every telling. The younger brother who let the elder drown, and inherited a dukedom before the ice had even melted. "He has offered to forgive the debts," her father said, all of them, and to settle a sum on your mother besides." He paused, and his hands were trembling. "His condition is marriage to you within the month." Clara stood very still. "Why?" she asked. "Why me? He has never met me. He could marry any woman in England." "No, Clara." Her father finally raised his eyes, and they were red and hollow. "He couldn't. No family will give him a daughter. No woman will take his hand. They say he wants an heir, that he needs one, and that we are the only family desperate enough to say yes." His voice broke. Forgive me, but if you refuse, I am destroyed. Your mother will be on the street. I am begging you." Her mother stood in the doorway, crying. Her father sat before her, broken. And somewhere on that hill, behind those iron gates, a man everyone feared was waiting for an answer. "Clara," her mother whispered, "I know what they say about him. I know what he did. I am so sorry. I am so sorry, my girl." And here is the strange thing. The thing no one in that room could possibly have understood. Clara looked down at the letter with the black raven seal, and the thought that rose in her mind was not fear. It was not dread. It was a single, quiet sentence that she had carried inside her, locked away for 15 years, a sentence she had never once spoken aloud, not even to God. "I know what they say he did, and they are all wrong." "Tell the Duke," Clara said calmly, "that I accept." The wedding took place on a cold, gray morning in the small stone church at the edge of the Ravenhall estate. There were no flowers. There were no guests beyond the required witnesses. The Duke had made the arrangements himself, in writing, through his steward. He had not visited Clara. He had not written her so much as a single line. She had not laid eyes on him at all until the moment she walked through the church doors and saw him standing at the altar. Julian Thorne, Duke of Ravenhall, was 36 years old, tall and dressed in black. His face might once have been called handsome, and perhaps it still was, in the way a winter landscape is handsome, cold, sharp, and closed. His dark hair was streaked with early gray at the temples. He stood perfectly straight and perfectly still, like a man enduring something rather than living it. And his eyes, everyone always talked about his eyes, gray, pale, and utterly unreadable, eyes that had made grown men stammer and look away. Clara walked toward those eyes and did not look away. The ceremony was short. The priest raced through the words, mispronouncing half of them in his hurry. When the moment came to join hands, Clara noticed the priest flinch, as if he could hardly bear to place a woman's hand into the Duke's. The Duke's hand was cold, but as it closed around her fingers, Clara felt something that surprised her, the faintest tremor, so small that no one else could have noticed it. The man everyone feared had a trembling hand. She glanced up at him. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He looked, Clara thought, like a man who fully expected the woman beside him to faint or weep or flinch away from his touch, and was bracing himself for it. She did none of those things. She simply held his hand, steady and warm, until the priest finished. "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss. The Duke released her hand the moment it was done, gave the priest a curt nod, and turned toward the doors. The whole church seemed to exhale at once. It was done. Clara Hayward was now Clara Thorne, Duchess of Ravenhall, married to the most feared man in England. The carriage ride to the great house passed in complete silence. The Duke sat across from her, looking out the window at the bare winter trees. Clara sat with her hands folded, looking at him openly, which, she would learn later, was itself an act of madness. No one looked at the Duke, not directly, not for more than a second. Twice she caught him glancing at her, and twice he looked away when their eyes met, quickly, almost angrily, like a man who had been caught doing something forbidden. The iron gates of Ravenhall opened for the first time in 15 years to admit a bride. The house rose up before her, enormous and gray, with 100 dark windows. The servants stood lined up on the front steps to receive their new mistress, and Clara saw at once that every single one of them was terrified, not of her, but of the man stepping out of the carriage behind her. An old housekeeper with white hair curtsied so deeply she nearly fell. A young maid was visibly shaking. The butler announced dinner in a voice that cracked in the middle. Dinner was served in a dining room built for 60 people, at a table long enough for 30. The Duke sat at one end. Clara had been seated at the other, so far away that they would have needed to raise their voices to speak. They did not speak. The food was excellent and Clara ate it, which seemed to astonish the footmen. Apparently they had expected the new Duchess to be too frightened to eat. From the far end of the table, the Duke watched her over his untouched plate, watched her calmly butter her bread in the house of the monster of Ravenhall, with that same flicker of confusion he had shown at the altar. When the meal ended, the housekeeper led Clara upstairs to her rooms. At the door, the old woman hesitated and then whispered, so quickly and quietly that Clara almost missed it. "Lock your door at night, Your Grace, please. This is a good house, but lock your door." Then she was gone. Clara stood alone in the grand bedroom that was now hers. She looked at the heavy brass key sitting in the lock. She did not turn it. She sat by the fire, still in her wedding dress, and waited, because somehow she knew that he would come. And a little before midnight he did. There was no knock, just footsteps in the corridor stopping outside her door, a long silence. Clara could see the shadow of his boots in the gap beneath the door. The shadow did not move for a full minute. Then his voice came through the door, low, rough, and strained, the voice of a man asking a question against his own will. "You did not lock your door." "No, Your Grace," Clara answered, "I did not." Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, there was something raw underneath the coldness, something that sounded almost like anger or pain. "The priest could barely finish the ceremony, he was so afraid of me. Your father sold you to me and could not look me in the face. My own servants tremble when I pass them in the hall. Half of England believes I murdered my own brother." A pause. "And you sit there behind an unlocked door on your wedding night in the house of the Duke everyone fears. So I will ask you one question, madam, and I want the truth." His voice dropped lower. "Why are you not afraid of me?" Clara looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought of a frozen lake 15 years ago. She thought of things she had seen that no one, not her father, not her mother, not this man on the other side of the door, knew she had seen. And she gave him the only piece of the truth she could afford to give. "Because I know what a monster looks like, Your Grace," she said quietly, "and you are not one." Silence. She heard him take one sharp breath. The shadow beneath the door stayed frozen in place, 1 second, 2, 3, as if the man in the corridor had been struck and could not move. Then the footsteps retreated down the hall, faster than they had come, and a distant door closed hard. Julian Thorne, the Duke of Ravenhall, the man who frightened all of England, stood alone in his room that night, staring into the dark. 15 years. 15 years of watching every face in every room turn away from him. 15 years of whispers, of frightened servants, of empty ballrooms. He had built his entire life around being feared. Fear kept people away. Fear kept questions away. Fear was simple and safe, and he understood it. He did not understand the woman behind that unlocked door. "I know what a monster looks like, and you are not one." She was wrong, of course. She had to be wrong. She knew nothing about him. She had never met him before this morning. She was simply naive or foolish or playing some game he had not yet worked out. And yet, the way she had said it, calm, certain, without a trace of doubt, that was not the voice of a naive girl. That was the voice of someone who knew something. But that was impossible. No one knew anything. No one had been there. No one in 15 years had ever once looked at him the way that woman looked at him today, as if she could see straight through the story that had swallowed his whole life. The Duke sat down slowly in the chair by his cold fireplace. "Who are you?" he whispered to the empty room. He would have his answer. He promised himself that. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would find out why his wife was the only person in England who did not fear him. He could not have known, on that first night, that the answer had been sleeping under his own roof for one day already. Or that when he finally uncovered it, it would not only destroy everything he believed about his wife. It would destroy everything he believed about the night that ruined his life. The Duke of Ravenhall had decided, by the second morning of his marriage, that his wife was lying. Not with words. She had barely spoken a dozen sentences to him. No, she was lying with her calmness, with her steady hands at the breakfast table, with her unlocked door. Nobody, he told himself, could truly stand this close to the monster of Ravenhall and feel nothing. She was pretending, and pretenses in his experience cracked under pressure. So he decided to crack her. It began at breakfast. The Duke entered the dining room without a word of greeting, sat down, and fixed her with the long, cold stare that had once made a member of Parliament spill his wine down his own shirt. It was a stare that said, "I am the man from the stories. Remember what they say I did." Clara looked up from her toast, met the stare, and said, "Good morning, Your Grace. Did you sleep well?" Nobody had asked the Duke of Ravenhall whether he slept well in 15 years. "No," he said before he could stop himself. "I thought not. You have shadows under your eyes." She returned, unbothered, to her toast. "You should try warm milk with honey. It works on stubborn children and stubborn dukes alike, or so my father always claimed." At the sideboard, a footman made a strangled sound and turned it into a cough. The Duke stared at his wife for a long moment, found absolutely nothing to say, and opened his newspaper with a violent snap of paper. Behind the newspaper, though he would have denied it under oath, the corner of his mouth twitched. The tests grew harder after that. He gave orders that she was not to enter the East Wing, in a voice designed to make her imagine horrors behind every locked door. She simply said, "As you wish," and never once tried the handles, which somehow irritated him more than disobedience would have. He took her deliberately on a walk past the frozen lake, watching her face from the corner of his eye, waiting for her to shudder at the famous water where his brother had died, waiting for the fear to finally show itself. Instead, Clara stopped at the shore, looked out over the gray ice for a long, quiet moment, and said something so strange that he lay awake that night turning it over. "It is smaller than I remembered." "Remembered," he said sharply. "You have been to Ravenhall before." Something flickered across her face, there and gone in half a heartbeat. "Everyone in the county grows up hearing about this lake, Your Grace," she said smoothly. "In my imagination it was the size of the sea. That is all I meant." He watched her walk on ahead of him, her breath making little clouds in the cold air, and the question that lived in his chest tightened its grip. That flicker. He had seen it. He had spent 15 years reading fear in people's faces, and he knew what it looked like when someone slammed a door inside themselves. His wife had just slammed one. The strangest thing of all was the servants. The Duke ran his house on silence and distance. The staff spoke when spoken to, kept their eyes down, and feared him, which was how he wanted it. Fear was order. Fear was safety. Within 1 week, his new Duchess had ruined everything. She learned the names of all 40 servants' first names, which no mistress of Ravenhall had ever bothered with. She discovered that the young shaking maid, Betsy, shook not from fear of the Duke but from an ill mother in the village and no money for a doctor, and by Thursday, Clara had written to her own father, and by Sunday the mother had been seen, treated, and supplied with medicine. She found out the cook had been quietly feuding with the butler for 11 years over an accusation about a missing silver spoon, sat them both down at the kitchen table like two sulking schoolboys, and made peace between them in the time it took a kettle to boil. The Duke watched all of this from doorways and windows, with the expression of a man watching someone walk unharmed through fire. She reorganized the linen cupboards. His housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, reported to him in the tone of a woman announcing a miracle. "Your Grace, the West Stairs maids are singing." "Singing," the Duke repeated flatly. "Singing, Your Grace, in this house." He should have been angry. He kept trying to be angry. But that week, walking past the West Stairs and hearing, for the first time in 15 years, the sound of a human being singing under his roof, the Duke of Ravenhall stopped in the corridor, closed his eyes, and stood there without moving until the song was finished. He never mentioned it to anyone. But Clara was making discoveries of her own. It was Betsy who let the first secret slip, chattering with gratitude about her mother's recovery. "It's like the widow's money, Your Grace," the girl said, and then went white and covered her mouth. "What widow's money?" Clara asked gently. It took some coaxing, but the story came out. Every quarter, for as long as anyone in the village could remember, money arrived at the homes of the parish widows. Envelopes, plain and unsigned, delivered by a hired man from another town. Enough for coal, for bread, for rent. 15 years of it. The village had long ago decided it came from the old vicar's charity fund. "But my cousin works at the bank in Millbrook, Your Grace," Betsy whispered, "and she says the vicar's fund hasn't a penny in it. She says the envelopes come from an account with no name on it. And the account," the girl glanced at the door, "the account was opened 15 years ago, the same winter as—" She didn't finish. In this house, no one ever finished that sentence. Clara stood at the window for a long time after Betsy left, watching the tall, dark figure of her husband crossing the frost-covered garden below, alone, as he always was. 15 years of unsigned envelopes. 15 years of letting the whole world call him a murderer while he secretly paid for widow's coal. "Oh, you foolish man," she whispered against the cold glass. "You want them to fear you. It's easier than letting them near." That evening at dinner, the Duke noticed his wife looking at him differently. Not with the calm that so unsettled him, with something warmer, something that unsettled him a great deal more. "You are staring, madam," he said stiffly. "Yes," Clara agreed, and continued doing it. The Duke ate the rest of his meal in confused silence, and that night caught himself standing in front of his mirror trying to see what she had been looking at. By the end of the second week, something in the great gray house had shifted. The Duke no longer took breakfast behind his newspaper. They had begun, cautiously, like two people crossing thin ice, to talk about books, about the estate, about nothing. Twice she had made him laugh. Actually laugh out loud, a rusty sound that startled them both and sent a footman hurrying to the kitchen to report it like news of war. The Duke fought it every step. He reminded himself that she was hiding something, that the flicker by the lake had been real, that no one gives calmness like hers for free. He would find the crack in her. He would. But he was no longer entirely sure he wanted to. And then, on a bright, cold Saturday morning, a carriage came up the drive, glossy, expensive, and completely unexpected. The Duke stood at his study window and watched it with narrowing eyes, and Clara, coming down the main stairs, saw through the tall hall windows a gentleman step out onto the gravel. He was perhaps 40, golden-haired, dressed in the height of London fashion, with the kind of warm, open, handsome face that made strangers trust him on sight. He was smiling before the front doors even opened. He tipped the coachman generously. He greeted the butler by name, clasped the old man's hand, and asked after his rheumatism. "Who is that?" Clara asked Mrs. Fletcher quietly. "That, Your Grace, is Mr. Victor Thorne. His Grace's cousin. The housekeeper's voice was carefully, perfectly neutral, the voice of a servant with strong opinions and no permission to hold them. The only family who still visits. Such a warm gentleman, everyone says. The whole county adores him. Victor Thorne stepped into the great hall, spread his arms wide, and his rich, pleasant voice rolled up the staircase. "Julian, you gloomy old devil, married, and I have to hear it from a newspaper. Where is she? Where is this brave woman? I must." And then he saw her on the stairs and stopped. For the rest of her life, Clara would remember that moment in perfect detail. The sunlight on the black and white marble floor, the smell of beeswax polish, and the face of the man below her, the warm, laughing, handsome face she had last seen 15 years ago, twisted with rage in the moonlight on the shore of a frozen lake. Clara's hands began to tremble. She gripped the banister to hide it, but it was too late. From the study doorway the Duke had seen. The Duke, who had spent 2 weeks searching his wife for a single crack of fear, who had stared at her, tested her, led her past the lake itself and found nothing, now watched her turn pale and clutch the railing at the sight of his charming, harmless, universally beloved cousin. Victor recovered his smile in an instant, sweeping into a graceful bow. "Your Grace," he said warmly, "forgive me for staring. I was told my cousin had married, but no one told me the new Duchess was so lovely. Welcome, welcome to the family." He climbed the stairs and took her cold hand and kissed it, and his eyes, up close, were exactly as she remembered them. "I so look forward," said Victor Thorne pleasantly, "to knowing you better." From across the hall, Julian watched his wife, the woman who did not fear the monster of Ravenhall, stand rigid as a statue with her hand in his cousin's, and one thought cut through him, cold and sharp and impossible to put away. "She is not afraid of me, but she is afraid of him." Why? Victor Thorne stayed for dinner. He was, Clara had to admit, brilliant at it. He filled the cold dining room with warmth like a fire catching. He told stories that made the footmen bite their cheeks to keep from laughing. He remembered that the butler's daughter had married a naval man and asked after her. He teased his grim cousin with the easy affection of a man teasing a beloved brother, and drew the whole table, even the Duke, even Clara, into something that almost resembled a family dinner. He was warm, he was charming, he was perfect. And Clara, smiling and answering and passing the salt, watched him the way one watches a snake moving through tall grass. Because she noticed what no one else at that table seemed to notice. She noticed how Victor's stories, every one of them so warmly, so lovingly, made Julian smaller. A funny tale about their boyhood in which Julian was the strange, jealous child. A tender memory of Edmund in which Julian stood always at the edge, always in the shadows, always wanting what his brother had. Little strokes, tiny brush strokes, each one wrapped in affection, each one impossible to object to. 15 years of this, Clara thought, her blood running cold behind her smile. 15 years of dinners and drawing rooms and hunting parties all across England. This is how the story stayed alive, not through enemies. Through the loving cousin who never stopped grieving. "Do you know, Your Grace," Victor said to her over dessert, his voice dropping into gentle sorrow, "I am the only one left who visits. Society can be so cruel, they believe such dreadful things about poor Julian." He shook his golden head sadly. "I have defended him for 15 years. I tell everyone that no one can prove what happened on that ice. No one can prove a thing." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one can prove, not he is innocent, not he loved his brother, just no one can prove. It was masterful. It was poison served as medicine, and Clara watched her husband receive it, watched Julian's jaw tighten and his eyes go flat and distant, watched him pulled back, right there at his own table to the worst night of his life, and she understood with sudden furious clarity that this had been done to him 100 times. 1,000. That the man everyone called cold had been slowly frozen, year by year, dinner by dinner, by the warmest man in the room. Her hand closed hard around her napkin under the table. "How comforting, Mr. Thorne," she heard herself say pleasantly, "that His Grace has such a devoted defender. Tell me, were you at Ravenhall that winter? You speak of the night as if you knew it well." For one instant, less than a blink, less than a breath, Victor Thorne's smile stopped moving. It stayed on his face, but it stopped being alive, like a portrait of a smile. "I arrived the following morning," he said smoothly, "too late, to my everlasting grief." "Ah," said Clara, "of course too late." Their eyes met across the candles, and something passed between them, silent, invisible to the two other people at the table, something older than this dinner and colder than the ice on that lake. A question and an answer, a key turning in a lock. Victor's smile returned to life, warmer than ever. But when he lifted his wine, Clara saw what she saw and could never afterward unsee. His hand was not entirely steady. That night, long after the house had gone dark, Clara stood at her window unable to sleep and saw a light burning in the study below. She went down. Julian sat by the dying fire with an untouched glass of brandy, still in his dinner clothes, staring at nothing. He looked up when she entered, and for once he did not put on the cold mask fast enough. For half a second she saw what lived underneath it, and it broke her heart. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." She sat across from him, uninvited. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, wind moved through the black trees. "Why did you marry me, Julian?" It was the first time she had ever asked him directly. Perhaps it was the hour, or the brandy, or the strange raw crack that dinner had left in him, but this time he answered. "Because I am going to die, madam." He said it flatly, like a man reading a ledger. "Not soon, God willing, but one day. And when I do, everything, this house, this land, the tenants, the village, 400 people whose roofs and livings depend on this estate, all of it passes to my nearest male relative." His mouth twisted. "You dined with him tonight." The fire popped. Clara sat very still. "Victor," Julian went on, and there was something in the way he said the name, tired, careful, like a man handling a blade, "is charming. Everyone adores Victor, and Victor is drowning in debts he believes no one knows about. Gambling debts, London debts, the kind that swallow estates whole. I know because quietly over the years I have watched him mortgage everything his father left him." He looked into the fire. "If Ravenhall falls to him, he will strip it to the walls within 5 years. Every farm sold, every servant turned out. My brother loved this land more than his life. I will not hand it to—" He stopped himself. "To," Clara said softly. "To anyone who would harm it," he finished and drank. He does not know, Clara realized, watching him over the firelight. He thinks Victor is merely greedy. He drinks poison from that man's hand at his own table, defends his estate against him like a good steward, and he has no idea. No idea what his cousin is. No idea what his cousin did. The words rose in her throat like a flood against a dam. 15 years of them. "Julian, listen to me. That night on the lake you were not alone. I saw everything. It was not you, it was never you, it was." And then, like cold water, came the memory of her father's face on a winter night long ago. Her father, the kindest man she knew, kneeling in front of her, gripping her 10-year-old shoulders hard enough to hurt, his eyes wild with a fear she had never seen in him before or since. "You saw nothing, Clara. Do you hear me? Nothing. If you ever say otherwise to anyone ever, I cannot protect this family. Swear it. Swear it on your mother's life." She had sworn. She did not fully understand, even now, what threat had been made against her father in those days after the drowning. She only knew that Dr. Hayward had been called to Ravenhall that night to attend a drowned man, that he had brought his sleeping daughter rather than leave her home alone in the storm, and that he had come away from that house, a changed and frightened man who never spoke of it again. If she told Julian now with no proof, nothing but the 15-year-old memory of a hidden child, what would happen? Victor's word against hers. The beloved cousin against the desperate doctor's daughter who had married for money. And her father, her weak, guilty, beloved father, who had kept a secret that was not his to keep. What would become of him? The dam held. The flood stayed behind her teeth, but she could not stay entirely silent. Not after tonight. Not after watching that man pour poison into her husband's wounds and smile. Julian, she leaned forward. I want you to listen to me, and I want you to do something for me without asking why. Do not trust your cousin. Not with your estate, not with your affairs, not with anything. Keep him far from you. Julian went very still. That is a remarkable thing to say, he said slowly, about a man you met 8 hours ago. I know. He was warmth itself to you tonight. He was. Then explain it to me. He set down the glass. He was watching her now the way he had watched her that first week. No, more sharply than that, with everything in him focused to a single point. And she saw the study door reflected in his eyes and realized this was not a request. You went white when he entered my house this morning, madam. You, who walked past that lake as if it were a garden pond, who sleep behind an unlocked door in the monster of Ravenhall's house. You gripped that banister today as if you were drowning. I have spent 2 weeks asking myself why you are not afraid of me. Now I find there is something in this world you fear after all, and it is the one man in England who still calls me family. His voice dropped, rough and urgent. So tell me why, Clara. Look at me and tell me why. The fire hissed. The clock on the mantel ticked once, twice, 3 times. I cannot, Clara whispered. Cannot, he repeated, or will not. She said nothing. She looked at him, at the man she had watched for 2 weeks paying for widow's coal in secret and pretending to be stone, the man she had known in the one way that mattered, longer than anyone alive, and she said nothing at all. Julian rose from his chair. All the rawness of the evening was gone from his face. The mask came down over it like ice closing over dark water, and Clara felt the cold of it from across the hearth. For 2 weeks, he said quietly, I could not understand you. I told myself, she is hiding something, no one is calm for free. Then I began to hope I was wrong. I began to think. He broke off with a short, bitter breath. It seems my first instinct was sound. You know something, madam, about my cousin. Perhaps about more than my cousin. And you sit in my house at my fire, wearing my ring, and you will not say what it is. Julian. Good night, your grace. He walked out. The study door closed behind him with a click that was somehow worse than a slam, and Clara sat alone in the light of the dying fire, her heart hammering against the secret it had guarded for 15 years. The secret that had, tonight, for the first time, begun to guard itself against her. Upstairs, in the dark of the corridor, Julian Thorne stopped outside his wife's empty room and stood there for a long moment, hating himself for what he was about to do, and doing it anyway. The next morning, he wrote 2 letters. The first was to his solicitor in London, instructing him to make discreet inquiries into the financial affairs of Mr. Victor Thorne, deeper than before this time. Everything. Every debt, every associate, every rumor. The second letter took him much longer. He sat over it for the better part of an hour, and twice nearly burned it, and was ashamed of himself when he finally sealed it. It was addressed to a private inquiry agent in Millbrook, a quiet man who found things out for money and asked no questions, and it contained a single instruction. Find out everything there is to know about the past of Dr. Thomas Hayward and his daughter, especially the winter of 15 years ago. For 5 days after that night in the study, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenhall lived like 2 strangers sharing an inn. They met at meals. They spoke of the weather, of household matters, of nothing. The ease of those first 2 weeks, the talk, the teasing, the rusty laughter was gone as if it had never existed. The servants felt it the way sailors feel a change in the wind, and the singing on the west stairs went quiet again. Julian told himself this was better. Distance was clarity. She was keeping secrets in his house, and until his letters bore fruit, until he knew what she knew, coldness was the only sensible course. He told himself this every day, several times a day, which should have been his first clue that it was not working. Because the truth was that he missed her at breakfast when she answered his stiff good morning and nothing more, missed her in the evenings when she retired early with a book and a polite nod. He had lived alone in this house for 15 years and had never once in all that time known that it was lonely. It had taken her 2 weeks to teach him what loneliness was, and 5 days to make him feel it. And there was something else, something that had begun to eat at him in the sleepless hours. He was ashamed of the second letter. The first, the one about Victor, sat easily on his conscience. But the other one, the quiet man in Millbrook, the instruction to dig through the past of his wife and her father like a thief going through drawers. Every time Clara passed him in a corridor with her calm, wounded politeness, he thought of that letter, and something in his chest turned over. On the 6th day, the storm came. It rolled in off the hills in the late afternoon, black and enormous, and it caught the Duke and Duchess of Ravenhall a full 3 miles from home. They had gone out separately, Julian to see a tenant about a collapsed barn roof, Clara to bring a basket to Betsy's recovering mother, and met, entirely by accident, at the crossroads by the old chapel just as the first fat drops began to fall. There was one shelter within a mile, the chapel itself, a small stone building, half forgotten, used twice a year at most. They reached its doorway together, soaked to the skin, just as the sky split open. Inside it was dim and cold and smelled of old stone and older dust. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Julian dragged the heavy door shut against the wind, and then they were alone, dripping in the gray half-light, with nowhere to go and nothing to hide behind, no long dinner table, no newspapers, no servants, no doors. Clara sneezed. It was somehow that small human sound that broke him. Julian looked at his wife, the impossible, infuriating, unreadable Duchess of Ravenhall, standing in a puddle of her own dripping skirts with her hair collapsing out of its pins, and he began, helplessly, to laugh. Clara stared at him. Then the corner of her mouth betrayed her, and a moment later they were both laughing, truly laughing, the kind that feeds on itself and will not stop, the kind that bends you over and leaves you gasping. 15 years of ice and 5 days of silence, all of it cracking at once in a dusty chapel while the storm roared. "Forgive me," Julian managed at last, wiping his eyes. "It is only you look. I am aware of how I look, your grace. Like a very dignified drowned cat. And you look like a scarecrow that has been left out all winter. Sit down. If we cannot be dry, we can at least be ridiculous sitting down." There was old split firewood stacked by the little hearth, left over from some Christmas service, and a flint box on the mantel. Julian knelt to build a fire, and Clara sat on the front pew ringing out her hymns, and slowly, as the small flames caught and the light turned gold, the last 5 days melted out of the room. They talked, not about the weather. He told her about Edmund, not the night, never the night, but before it. The brother the whispers had erased, Edmund who put a frog in the bishop's hat at 9 years old, Edmund who could not sing but sang anyway loudly on horseback. Edmund who was going to be the finest landlord in the county and knew every tenant's child by name. Julian talked, and the words came out of him like water from a broken dam, 15 years of them, and Clara listened with her chin on her hand and did not once look away. "You loved him," she said softly. "He was the best man I have ever known." Julian stared into the fire. "What they say I did to him, the world believing it year after year, that was never the worst part. The worst part is that the story swallowed him too. No one remembers Edmund anymore. They only remember how he died. He has become a chapter in the tale of his monstrous brother. His voice went quiet. I would have carried the whispers gladly all my life if they had only left him whole. The fire cracked. Clara looked at her husband's bowed head, and it took everything she had, everything, not to speak. Instead, she reached out slowly, the way one reaches toward a wild thing, and took his hand. He flinched, but he did not pull away. And that was when the light of the fire fell fully across his hands for the first time, and Clara saw the scars. She had noticed them before, distantly, a roughness, an old damage half hidden by cuffs and gloves and shadow. But now up close in the firelight she saw them truly, the backs of both hands and the fingers laced with pale, deep, ragged lines. Old scars, terrible scars. Ice scars. The kind a man's hands earn when he drives them, over and over and over through the frozen edge of a lake, breaking a path with bare fists through water that cuts like glass, long past feeling, long past sense, long past hope. She had seen those hands earn them. Clara's eyes filled before she could stop them. One tear escaped and dropped onto his scarred knuckles, and Julian's whole body went rigid. He misunderstood, of course, completely. "Do not," he said hoarsely, pulling his hand back. "Do not weep at them. I know what they look like. I know what people think when they see them, proof, they think, marks of that night, the murderer's hands." He curled them closed. "Mrs. Fletcher has spent 15 years pretending not to see them. I should have worn gloves." "Julian." "It was thoughtless of me." "Julian." Her voice cracked like a whip and like a heart, both at once, and he stopped. Clara took his closed fist in both her hands and held it, and when she spoke again her voice was low and fierce and shaking. "Listen to me. I am only going to say this once, and you are going to believe me. These are not the hands of a murderer. These are the finest hands I have ever seen on any man, and if the world had one drop of sense, women would weep over these hands, and men would be ashamed before them, and her breath caught, and you should never, never hide them again." Silence. The rain drummed. Julian Thorne stared at his wife as a starving man stares at bread. "How," he said at last, barely above a whisper, "can you possibly know what my hands are?" And there it was again, the cliff edge, the flood against the dam, the truth trying to tear itself out of her. "I know because I saw them bleeding on the ice while you screamed his name. I know because I have known for 15 years, since I was 10 years old, hiding in the dark and watching the bravest thing I have ever seen." "I know you," was all she said. "That is all, I simply know you." It was not an answer. They both knew it was not an answer. But this time Julian did not press. He looked down at her small hands wrapped around his ruined one, and he made a choice consciously, the way a man steps off a ledge. He chose not to care what she was hiding, whatever it was, whoever she was. The woman holding his hands believed in him, and he had gone 15 years without that, and he did not have the strength to push it away twice. "Clara," he said, just her name. It was the first time he had ever said it aloud, and it came out like a confession. The storm blew itself out at dusk. They walked the 3 miles home through the dripping, glittering dark, side by side, her arm through his, talking the whole way, and the footman who opened the great door and saw the feared Duke of Ravenhall come in from the night soaked, muddy and smiling, went straight down to the kitchen and reported that the master was possibly, God help them all, happy. 2 days later, Victor Thorne came back. He came uninvited, as family does, gliding in on some errand about a horse auction, and stayed for tea and was delightful. But something had changed in him, and Clara felt it before he had finished his first cup. His warmth was the same. His stories were the same. But behind the laughing eyes something was working now, turning, sorting, searching, and it was pointed at her. He watched her pour. He watched her speak. He watched her the way a man watches a puzzle, or a locked drawer, or a face glimpsed once in a crowd years ago. And then, as the tea was cooling and the talk had wandered to the county and its families, Victor set down his cup, tilted his golden head, and said, in a tone of light, idle, perfect innocence, "Forgive me, your grace, it has been nagging at me since the wedding and I cannot let it rest. Have we met before? Not in society, I would remember that. Somewhere else, long ago perhaps." He smiled his warm, dead smile, and his eyes did not smile at all. "Your face, you see. There is something about your face I know. I never forget a face. It always comes back to me eventually where I saw it. It always comes back." The fire ticked in the grate. The Duke, reaching for the teapot, noticed nothing. Clara held her saucer perfectly level and met the eyes she had last seen by moonlight on the shore of a frozen lake, and heard her own voice answer, from very far away. "I am sure I would remember meeting you, Mr. Thorne." "Yes," said Victor Thorne softly, still smiling, still watching. "Yes, I am sure you would." Victor Thorne did not sleep on the night after that tea. He sat in his rented rooms in Millbrook with a bottle of brandy he did not drink, staring at the wall, chasing a face through 15 years of memory, because he had not been entirely honest at the Duchess's tea table. He did not merely find her face familiar. Her face frightened him. And Victor Thorne had built his entire comfortable, golden, smiling life on the certainty that nothing in this world was left to frighten him. There had been only one dangerous night in his history, one, and he had spent 15 years wrapping it, sealing it, burying it under charm and grief and 1,000 sorrowful dinner-table performances. No witnesses, no proof. The only other man on that ice was at the bottom of a churchyard, and the man blamed for it obligingly wore the guilt like a coat and asked no questions. It was finished. It had been finished for 15 years. So why did the new Duchess of Ravenhall look at him the way she did, level, cold, knowing? And why, when he searched for her face in his memory, did his mind keep circling back, again and again, like a dog to a buried bone, to winter? He began the next morning to dig. It was easy. That was the horror of it, how easy it was. The Duchess's history was no secret. Clara Hayward, daughter of Dr. Thomas Hayward, the physician at Aldenbury, 8 miles from Ravenhall, married off to settle her father's gambling debts. The county had chewed the scandal thoroughly. A doctor's daughter, from 8 miles away. Victor stood very still in the middle of the street when that thought landed, and a passing farmer's wife wished him good morning, and got no answer from the county's warmest gentleman. Because Victor Thorne had told one small lie for 15 years, so smoothly and so often that he half believed it himself, I arrived the following morning, too late, to my everlasting grief. But he had not arrived the following morning. He had been there that night, there before, there during, thereafter, and he remembered that night not in stories but in his skin. The cold, the shouting, the crack of the ice like a pistol shot. And afterward the panicked hours in the smallest hours of the morning, the servants running, the lanterns on the shore. And the doctor. Someone had ridden through the storm to fetch the doctor. Victor had stayed out of sight by then, in the dark of the boathouse, watching the shore, making certain of what the night would become before he chose his part in it. And he had seen the doctor's gig come up the lake road, lantern swinging. He had seen the doctor climb down and run to the men on the shore. And he had seen, merciful God, he had seen it and forgotten it. It had meant nothing for 15 years, a small shape left behind in the gig, wrapped in a blanket. A sleeping child, brought through the storm because there was no one to leave her with. A little girl. The bottle of brandy did get drunk after that, most of it, and it did not help at all. Because now the memories were coming up out of the ground where he had buried them, and they were coming up wrong. The child in the gig asleep, but was she asleep? He had watched the shore for the better part of an hour from the boathouse dark. The gig had stood on the lake road all that time, the lake road with its clear, moonlit, terrible view of the ice, of the shore, of everything. He tried to remember whether the small shape had moved, whether the blanket had stirred, whether at any moment in that hour a child's face might have been at the rail, watching the moonlight, watching the water, watching him. No, Victor said aloud to the empty room. No, she was asleep. She was a child. She saw nothing. No one saw anything. But the county's warmest gentleman looked gray and old in his mirror that morning, and by noon he was in his carriage, and the carriage was on the road to Ravenhall. He found her, as he had planned to find her, alone. It was Thursday, and on Thursdays, as all the household knew, the Duke rode out to the eastern farms and did not return before dusk. Clara was in the walled winter garden, cutting the last of the hellebores, when the gravel crunched behind her and Victor Thorne's pleasant voice said, "White flowers in winter, how fitting, your grace. You have a talent for finding what survives the cold." Clara did not turn immediately. She finished the cut, laid the stem in her basket, and understood, in the way one understands a change in the air before a storm, that the moment she had been dreading since the wedding morning had arrived. Then she turned, and one look at his face confirmed it. The smile was there, but the searching was over. His eyes were not asking any more. They knew. "Mr. Thorne, my husband is at the eastern farms." "Yes," said Victor. "I know, that is rather the point." He strolled closer, gloved hands behind his back, admiring the flowers unhurried, and his voice remained light and warm and social throughout what followed, which made it the most frightening conversation of Clara's life. "I have had the most tiresome week, your grace. I have been trying to remember where I saw your face before. It came to me at last, you know, last night. It always comes back, I did tell you." "You are speaking in riddles, sir." "Aldenbury," said Victor pleasantly. "Dr. Hayward's daughter, the good doctor who was fetched through the snow to Ravenhall 15 winters ago to attend a drowned man. The good doctor who had no wife at home that year to mind his little girl, and so bundled her into the gig and brought her along. He plucked a hellebore, turned it in his fingers. The gig stood on the lake road for above an hour, your grace. I have been consulting my memory very closely about that gig, and about what a child inside it might have seen. The lake road has such a fine view of the ice by moonlight, such a very fine view." The winter garden was utterly silent. Somewhere beyond the wall a crow called once and was still. "I was asleep," Clara said. And she knew instantly, from the flare of triumph in his eyes, that she had made a terrible mistake. She had answered the real question. She had placed herself in the gig, on the road, on the night, she, who should have said, "I have not the faintest notion what you mean." 15 years of silence, undone in 3 words. "Ah," said Victor Thorne softly, "so you were there." He dropped the flower, and then, for the first time since she had known him, he let the warmth go out of his face. Deliberately, the way a man sets down a mask on a table, and what was underneath looked at her with flat, businesslike calm, and it was the face from the lakeshore, the face from her nightmares, 15 years older and infinitely more dangerous. "Let us save time, your grace. You will neither confirm nor deny what you saw, and it does not matter because I am not a court of law and I do not require proof. I require only arithmetic, and here is the arithmetic." He counted gently on his gloved fingers. 1. If you had proof, you would have used it 15 years ago, so you have none. You have only the word of a woman who watched something as a sleepy child of what, 9, 10, a decade and a half ago in the dark at a distance. 2. You said nothing for 15 years. Silence, your grace, is a confession of doubt. The moment you speak, all England will ask, "Why now?" And all England will answer, "Because she is the monster's wife and will say anything to whitewash him." You will not save your husband's name. You will bury it and yours with it. 3. He stepped closer and his voice dropped and became, if anything, kinder, which was the most obscene thing of all. "Your father. Think before you feel, your grace. A physician called to attend a suspicious death who saw fit to conceal that his own daughter was a witness, who silenced a child and held his tongue through 15 years while an innocent man was ruined. What do they call that, I wonder, in a court? Complicity. Obstruction. I dare say a clever lawyer could call it conspiracy. Your father is old and weak and, forgive me, a gambler whose character will not survive one afternoon of cross-examination. He will die in a cell, and the county that now pities him will spit on his name. You will have done that. You personally, with your mouth. And 4. He drew off one glove unhurried and examined his nails. Julian, do you know what 15 years of whispers could not do to my cousin? They could not break him. He is a remarkably durable creature. I have studied him closely. But you, your grace, you have achieved in a month what the whispers could not in 15 years. You have made him hope. The word came out with soft, genuine hatred. He laughs now, I am told. He came in from a storm smiling. And so at long last, he has something in his possession that can actually be taken from him. Do you understand what I am telling you? If you stand against me, if you breathe one syllable of Aldenbury or Giggs or Lake Roads to anyone, I will not go to war with you in a courtroom where I might lose. There are simpler roads. Accidents happen to doctors on winter rounds. Fires happen in old houses. Even dukes, your grace, even dukes drown. The garden tilted around her. Clara gripped her basket and stayed upright by pure will. What do you want? She whispered. Want? Victor pulled his glove back on, and the warmth flowed back into his face like water filling a mold, and the county's most beloved gentleman stood before her once more, smiling among the winter flowers. I want what I have always wanted, your grace. I want to wait. Julian has no heir. Julian's health, his line, his future, these are my inheritance, and I have been patient with them for 15 years. And then he married. You see my difficulty. A wife. A wife means children, and children mean I have knelt in the cold at that lake for nothing. He straightened his cuffs. So here is what will happen. You will end it. I do not care how, grow cold, grow cruel, take to your bed, manufacture a scandal, flee to your mother's people, drive him to an annulment. You are clever. The method is your affair. You have until the spring. If by Lady Day this marriage is not dead and you are not gone from Ravenhall, then, in whatever order amuses me most, I will destroy your father, your husband, and you. And Clara, he used her name for the first time softly, like a knife slid between ribs. I have done it before. Ask the lake. He bowed beautifully. Thank you for the flowers, your grace. Winter suits this garden. Do give my warmest love to my cousin. And he walked away across the gravel, golden and graceful, pausing at the gate to compliment the under-gardener on the yew hedges, and was gone. Clara stood among the hellebores until her hands stopped shaking enough to lift the basket. It took a long time. That evening, Julian came home from the eastern farms with mud to his knees, and for the second time in his adult life, a smile he had not planned. He had spent the day's long rides composing in his head something dangerously like happiness. Spring plans, the roof for the tenant, a thought half-formed, terrifying, sweet, about where in the house a nursery had once been and might be again. He looked for his wife at dinner, and dinner was the old silence. He told himself she was tired. He looked for her in the drawing room after, and she retired early with a headache behind a closing door. He told himself it was a headache. And late that night, unable to sleep, telling himself he would only ask after her health, Julian Thorne walked down the long corridor to his wife's room and stopped. Because there was a line of firelight under her door, so she was awake. And because, as he stood there in the dark gathering his courage like a boy, he heard from behind the door a sound he had never heard in all his life, a sound that unmanned him completely and pinned him to the spot. The sound of Clara, steady, unbreakable, fearless Clara, crying. Muffled, strangled, pressed into a pillow so the house would not hear, crying as if something inside her had been cut away. He raised his hand to knock. And inside the room, Clara, who had heard his footsteps, who knew that tread now better than her own heartbeat, who wanted nothing in the created world so much as to open that door, pressed the pillow harder against her mouth, and looked at the small portrait of her father on the mantel, and at the fire, and did the bravest and cruelest thing she had ever done. She rose, crossed the room silently, and turned the key in the lock. The click was very small. In the corridor, it landed on Julian like a blow. His raised hand hung in the air a moment, then fell. For the first time since their wedding night, his wife had locked her door. There is a particular cruelty in destroying a thing slowly, by hand, when every part of you is screaming to protect it. Clara learned that cruelty through the last weeks of winter, one cold morning at a time. She began with small things because the small things were all she could bear at first. She stopped coming down early to breakfast so that they no longer met over the toast and the teapot. She answered his questions with the fewest words politeness allowed. When he lingered in a doorway, she found a reason to be needed elsewhere. When he said her name, Clara, in that low voice that had once come out of him like a confession, she answered, "Yes, Your Grace," and watched something flinch behind his eyes. Your Grace, not Julian, never Julian again. That one wound she reopened daily because it was the one that worked best. The house felt it within a week. The singing on the west stairs stopped a second time, and this time it did not come back. Mrs. Fletcher began looking at Clara with a bewilderment that slowly curdled into something cooler, and Betsy, loyal, grateful Betsy, took to watching her mistress with wide, worried eyes, as if the Duchess had contracted an illness no one could name. She had, in a way. She simply could not tell anyone that the illness was called Lady Day, and that it was coming closer with every sunrise. Julian fought for her. That was the unbearable part, he fought. The man who had spent 15 years letting the entire world walk away from him without lifting a finger to stop a single person fought for her. He asked directly in his stiff, unpracticed way what he had done. He asked if it was the inquiry letters and confessed them, both of them voluntarily, the solicitor and the man in Millbrook, standing in the library with his jaw tight and his eyes miserable, like a man laying his own sins on the table. I recalled the second letter a week after I sent it, he said. Before the chapel, before the storm, I could not bear what it was. If that is what this is, if he found something, said something, frightened someone, tell me, and I will burn every page unread. He had recalled the letter. He had chosen trust over suspicion, blindly, weeks ago, and told no one. Clara looked at this man, this good, ruined, fighting man, offering to burn the very inquiry that might have unearthed her secret honestly, and she said, in a voice she manufactured somewhere far away from her own chest, "You may do as you please with your letters, Your Grace. It has nothing to do with me." And she walked out of the library and made it as far as the linen room before her legs gave out, and she sat on the floor among the folded sheets with both hands pressed over her mouth for a very long time. Spring came closer. The ice on the lake began to rot and darken, and Victor Thorne, who had eyes in the household, Clara never learned which ones, and it poisoned every friendly face, grew impatient with her progress. A cold marriage was not a dead one. Distance was not divorce. He needed the thing finished, notarized, irreversible, and he needed it before hope could find its way back in. And so, in the first week of March, Victor did what he did best. He stopped waiting for the truth and manufactured something better. It began with a letter that arrived for Clara on a Tuesday, hand-delivered, the footman said, by a boy from the village. Inside was a single line, unsigned, in a hand she knew now as well as her nightmares. The Garden Folly. Thursday, 4 o'clock. We must discuss the spring, Your Grace. Come alone, or I shall call at the house instead, and I do run on so, at dinner tables about old winters. A threat wrapped in a threat. Meet me, or I begin talking in front of Julian. She went. Of course she went. She stood in the cold stone folly at the far end of the garden at 4 o'clock on Thursday, and Victor arrived smiling, And what followed was 10 minutes of the same velvet menace, reminders, refinements, a new date pressure, his light, pleasant voice cataloging once more the order in which he would burn her life if she failed him. Clara stood rigid and white and said almost nothing. What she did not know, could not know, was that the same Tuesday boy had delivered a second message, to a different recipient. Julian's note was typed on his own steward's stationery, stolen or forged, and it said only that His Grace might wish to walk by the garden folly on Thursday at 4, regarding a matter concerning Her Grace. He nearly threw it in the fire. It reeked of servant's intrigue, of anonymous malice, of everything he despised. He carried it in his pocket for 2 days, hating it. And then Thursday came, and at 10 minutes to 4, he saw his wife slip out through the garden door, alone, glancing behind her, and his feet followed before his honor could stop them. He came up the yew walk in the failing light, silent on the wet grass, and stopped at the gap in the hedge with a clear view of the folly. And there, framed between the stone pillars like a painting hung deliberately for him, as it had been, every sightline of it chosen and rehearsed by Victor days in advance. The Duke of Ravenhall saw his wife standing close, far too close, in the winter dusk with his cousin. He could not hear the words. The distance and the wind saw to that Victor had chosen the day's weather with the patience of a fisherman. Julian could not hear his cousin's murmured threats, could not hear the arithmetic of ruin being recited over his wife's bowed head. He could only see. He saw Victor lean in and speak low and earnestly, the way a man speaks to a woman he knows well. He saw Clara, his Clara, who flinched from nothing on this earth, trembling before him. He saw Victor reach out and take her wrist, saw her let him hold it. And then he saw the masterstroke, the one detail Victor had crafted for an audience of one. His cousin drew from his coat a folded paper, pressed it into Clara's hand, and closed her fingers over it with both of his, tender, secret, unmistakable, and Clara took it, and hid it swiftly in her cloak, and looked around to see if anyone had observed. It was, in fact, a list of dates, Victor's new deadlines, his new instructions. Its contents would have exonerated her in 3 seconds. But paper at 40 yards has no contents. At 40 yards in the blue dusk, it was a letter passing between lovers, and it entered Julian Thorne like a blade entering a wound that had been 15 years in the making. Because here is what the whispers had truly done to him over 15 years, the deep damage, under the coldness and the iron gates. They had taught him in the marrow of his bones one lesson above all others. Whatever you love will be taken, and whatever seems too good to be true is. He had believed his brother's love, and the world said he had murdered it. He had believed for one winter in a fearless wife with warm hands, and there she stood in the dusk, hiding his cousin's letter in her cloak. She knew Victor. That was the thought that broke him, standing in the gap of the hedge with the wet cold soaking through his boots. She knew him from the first morning. She went white when he entered my hall. I asked her why, and she said, "I cannot." She warned me against him, God, the cleverness of it. She warned me against him, and I thought her frightened of him, when all along. The old story wrote itself in his head with the smooth, hideous ease of long practice, every fact snapping into its new place. The calmness that no innocent woman could have had. The unlocked door bait, the chapel, the firelight, the hands theater. And then the moment his solicitor's inquiries into Victor grew teeth, the moment the danger grew real, the wall, the coldness, the locked door, not grief, guilt. 2 conspirators cooling it off, waiting for the estate's future to arrange itself. It was insane. Some distant, drowning part of him knew it did not hold together, knew that no schemer weeps into a pillow at midnight, that the tear that had fallen on his scarred knuckles in the chapel had been real, that something was wrong with the picture in the folly, wrong in its very neatness, wrong the way Victor's grief had always been faintly, glossily wrong. But that voice was 15 years too quiet, and the other voice had 15 years of training, and the other voice said what it had always said, "You fool, You hoped. This is what hoping costs. Julian turned and walked back to the house through the dark, and did not run, and that was the last thing he could be proud of for a long time. He did not rage. That was the terrible thing. Clara thought afterward. There was no scene, no accusation, no chance to fight. Rage she could have worked with. Rage asks questions. Instead, at breakfast the next morning, she found her husband encased in a courtesy so complete, so glacially perfect, that her blood ran cold before he said a single word of substance. He looked like the Duke in the church again. He looked like the portrait of a man. "I have written to my solicitor," he said, buttering his toast with steady hands. "It occurs to me that this arrangement has served its purpose for us both. Your father's debts are discharged and shall remain so. I do not go back on a settled account. An annulment can be quietly obtained. There are grounds enough, as we both have cause to know. You will have a generous settlement and the use of the Millbrook house until you are established. I imagine you will not contest it." The world went white at the edges. Somewhere very far away, a cup found its saucer without spilling, and Clara heard her own voice, from that same great distance, say, "No, your grace, I will not contest it." For one instant, his composure cracked, and through the crack she saw not anger but a devastation so total, so childlike, that she nearly broke, nearly swept the table clear and told him everything, Victor and the lake and the gig and Lady Day and all of it. Consequences be damned. And then she saw, with the clarity of despair, the truth of her position. It had worked. Whatever had happened, whatever Victor had done, the marriage was dying exactly on schedule, and every day of it dying kept Julian alive. Even dukes drown. If she fought now, if she explained, if she won him back, she would be signing his death warrant with her love and her father's beneath it. Let him hate me, she thought, and the thought was a kind of dying. Hatred is survivable. I am the only thing he possesses that Victor can take from him, so let me be taken. Let me be the wall between him and that man for the rest of my life, and let him never, never know it. "As you wish," she said, "your grace." The papers came 10 days later in a leather folder, heavy with seals. They were laid out for her in the library on a Thursday morning. Julian did not attend. He had ridden out at dawn and taken care, the footman said, to be gone all day, and the solicitor's clerk showed her, with mortified delicacy, the places requiring her signature. Clara read nothing. She could not have seen the words in any case. She signed her name 4 times, in a hand that hardly shook at all, and laid down the pen, and thanked the clerk, and walked out of the library past the fireplace where a storm-soaked man had once laughed until he wept, and up the stairs past the window where she had first seen a golden monster step out of a carriage, and into her room, where her trunk stood already packed. She was to leave on Saturday morning. On Friday night, very late, Julian Thorne stood alone in the dark corridor outside his wife's door for the last time. He had come home after midnight, mud-spattered, half-frozen, having ridden all day to outrun a thing that rode faster than any horse. He did not know why he had come to her door. He had nothing to say. There was nothing left to say. Under the door, a line of firelight, and beyond it, silence. No weeping this time. Just the small sounds of a person moving quietly among packed trunks, and then not even that. He raised his hand to knock, the way he had on the first night, when a calm voice behind this door had told him he was not a monster and rearranged the stars in his sky. His hand hung in the dark. Then it fell, and he turned and walked away down the long corridor, and behind him, so quietly that he told himself, for years afterward, that he had imagined it. He heard the key turn softly in the lock, as if someone on the other side had been standing there all along, with her hand on the door, listening to him breathe. Saturday came gray and still. The carriage stood on the gravel at 9. The servants gathered in the hall to see her off, and Betsy wept openly, and Mrs. Fletcher's face was a fortress with its flag at half-mast, and the butler bowed lower to the departing Duchess than protocol had ever asked of him. The Duke of Ravenhall was not there. He stood instead at the window of his study, at the exact place where he had once watched a golden cousin arrive, and watched his wife cross the gravel in her gray traveling cloak. At the carriage step, Clara paused, and turned, and looked up directly at the study window at him without searching, as if she had known all along exactly where he would be standing. For 3 full seconds, across the cold morning air, the Duke and the woman who was no longer his Duchess looked at one another. Then she climbed in, and the door shut, and the wheels bit the gravel, and the carriage passed out through the iron gates of Ravenhall, which had opened 15 years apart for exactly 2 things: a bride coming in and the same bride going out. In the study, Julian Thorne stayed at the window long after the drive was empty. He was still standing there when, 3 miles away on the Millbrook Road, a rider passed Clara's carriage heading the opposite direction, toward Ravenhall at a gallop. A hired man, riding hard, with a sealed report in his satchel from a quiet inquiry agent who asked no questions. The letter Julian had recalled weeks ago. Recalled, but, through one clerk's error in a Millbrook office, never actually stopped. The rider from Millbrook reached Ravenhall a little before noon, and the butler carried the sealed report into the study on a silver tray, and the Duke of Ravenhall very nearly burned it unopened. He stood at the fireplace holding it, this cheap folded packet of paper from a quiet man who found things out for money, this last, shabby relic of a marriage that had rolled out through his gates 2 hours ago, and the flames were right there, and his hand actually moved toward them. What stopped him in the end was small and stupid, the agent's covering line on the outer sheet. Your Grace instructed that the inquiry be recalled. The recall arrived after the work was complete. As the fee is owed regardless, the findings are enclosed. The petty tidiness of it, the clerk's error, the invoice logic, the pennies wanting their accounts settled while a man stood in the ruins of his life. Julian sat down and broke the seal, meaning to glance at the thing once and then burn it with a clear conscience. He did not move from the chair for an hour. The report was short, dry, and thorough. Dr. Thomas Hayward, physician of Aldenbury, a modest career, a respected name, a weakness for cards that had begun, the agent noted the date with a bookkeeper's indifference, approximately 15 years ago. Before that winter, the doctor's accounts had been in order. After it, the man had begun to drink a little, gamble more than a little, decline slowly, like a house with a cracked beam, as though something that winter had broken him. And then, on the second page, the paragraph. It is established from the parish record and the recollection of 2 former Ravenhall servants that Dr. Hayward was summoned to the estate on the night of the drowning, arriving in his own gig between 1 and 2 o'clock. The doctor's wife being that year confined to her bed in Bath with her sister, and the household keeping no other help. It is confirmed by the stable hand who took the horse that the doctor did not come alone. His daughter, then aged 10, was asleep in the gig, and remained with it on the lake road while the doctor attended the shore. The daughter's name was Clara. The study was perfectly silent. Outside, far away, a dog barked twice and stopped. Julian Thorne sat with the page in his hand and felt the floor of the world tilt, slowly, enormously, the way ice tilts before it goes. She was there. 10 years old, asleep in a gig on the lake road. The lake road, he had walked it 10,000 times. He could see it without closing his eyes, the low road along the water with its clean, unbroken, moonlit view of everything. Of the ice, of the shore. Of him. It is smaller than I remembered. He heard her voice say it, standing at the frozen shore with her breath clouding, and heard his own sharp question, and saw again the flicker in her face. The door slamming shut inside her. Everyone in the county grows up hearing about this lake, Your Grace. I know what a monster looks like, and you are not one. Not faith, not madness, not a game. Testimony. Julian stood up so fast the chair went over behind him, because the next thought arrived like the second wave of a broken dam, colder and bigger than the first. If she saw me that night, then she saw everything that night. And what else was there to see on that ice, in that moonlight? What else? Whom else? That could make a fearless woman go white 15 years later at the sight of. Victor, he said aloud to the empty study. And the whole winter reassembled itself around that name in a single, sickening, crystalline instant, every scene of it turning over and showing its true face like cards flipped by a gambler's hand. Her hands trembling on the banister that first morning. Do not trust your cousin. I cannot tell you why. The tea and Victor's soft have we met before, and the folly in the dusk, Victor gripping her wrist, Victor folding her fingers over that paper. Not a lover's letter, you blind, trained, ruined fool, a threat. And then the wall, the coldness, the locked door, the signature, all of it beginning the very week Victor Thorne came back smiling into this house. She had not left him. She had been cut out of him by hand, by a craftsman, and she had let it be done. And there could only be one kind of reason a woman like Clara would let it be done. The reason had to be enormous. The reason had to be armed. Julian was through the study door before he knew he was moving, shouting for Mrs. Fletcher in a voice the house had not heard in 15 years, and the household came running from 3 directions at once. Her rooms, he said. Has anything of hers been left? Anything at all, I don't care if it's a hairpin. It was Betsy who spoke, white-faced, from the back of the huddle. Her Bible, Your Grace. The girl was twisting her apron. It was under the bed pillow. I found it not an hour ago when we stripped the room. I was going to send it after her to Millbrook, only, her voice wobbled, only it seemed wrong, sir, her going away and leaving her mother's Bible. She read it every night of her life here. She'd never leave it. Not unless she meant it to be found. They brought it to him in the study. A small, worn, brown leather Bible, the gilt long gone from the page edges, a woman's name faded on the flyleaf. Julian turned it in his hands the way a man handles an unexploded shell. Nothing between the pages, nothing written in the margins. He was about to set it down when his thumb, moving over the back cover, felt what a reader's thumb would never notice and a desperate man's could not miss. The binding was too thick, and along the inner edge of the back board, in thread that almost matched the leather, ran a line of small, neat, homemade stitches. His scarred hands were shaking so badly that Mrs. Fletcher had to bring him the letter knife. He slit the stitches one by one, and the old leather opened like a mouth, and inside, folded small and pressed flat by 15 years of scripture, lay 2 sheets of paper. The first was covered in a child's handwriting, careful, round, painstaking letters, a 10-year-old's very best hand, the hand a child uses for something she has decided is important, crowded to the edges of the page, the ink faded to brown. I am writing this because Papa says I must never tell it out loud, and I promised on Mama's life, but he did not say I could not write it, and I am afraid that when I am grown I will believe I dreamed it. I did not dream it. I, Clara Hayward, aged 10 years and 4 months, saw this with my own eyes, and it is true. Julian read it standing. Then he read it again, sitting, because his legs would no longer hold him. It was all there, set down in a child's plain, devastating words 3 days after the night itself, while every detail still burned. Waking cold in the gig, alone, the blanket slipped. The moon on the ice so bright it seemed like day. 2 gentlemen far out on the lake, near the black open water at the middle, shouting, one golden-haired, one dark. The child had not known their names then. She gave them the names she'd invented, huddled at the rail, the gold man and the dark man. The gold man shouting terribly at a 3rd gentleman, the tall, laughing one who had given her a peppermint once in Aldenbury when Papa physicked his horse. This detail recorded with a child's fierce precision, shouting about money, about papers, about being ruined. The tall one turning his back to walk away. The gold man seizing him. The struggle, brief and awful. The shove. The crack, wrote the child of 10, was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Louder than church bells. I hear it when I go to sleep. And then the part that Julian could not read in one attempt. The part he had lived, and never once told a living soul, and now met again in the round, pencil-perfect letters of a hidden child. The dark man running toward the black water while the gold man ran away toward the boathouse. The dark man throwing off his coat and going in, going under, coming up, going under again. The child's account of what came next ran to half the page, because the child had counted. He broke the ice with his hands, she wrote. He hit it and hit it. I counted so I would not cry. He hit the ice 40 times and more, and his hands were dark in the moonlight, and I understood the dark was blood. He screamed a name the whole time. He would not stop, and he would not stop, and when the men came with lanterns, 2 of them had to pull him out of the water, and he fought them to go back in. The gold man came out of the boathouse when the lanterns came, wrote Clara Hayward, aged 10 years and 4 months. He stood with the servants and put his hands over his face. But I saw him before the lanterns came. I saw him watching from the dark for a long time, doing nothing, while the dark man was in the water. The gold man is the monster. The dark man is the bravest man in the world. This is true, and I saw it. And one day when I am grown and no one can hurt Papa, I will find the dark man and tell him that somebody knows. The second sheet was newer. The same hand grown, Clara's adult writing, dated on their wedding day. I found the dark man, it said. Or God found him for me, I cannot tell the difference anymore. Today I married him. He does not know who I am, and I cannot tell him because the promise still stands and Papa is still afraid, and I still have no proof but my own eyes. But he asked me tonight, through the door, why I am not afraid of him. Someday, if you are reading this, Julian, then something has gone wrong or something has finally gone right, and either way you deserve the answer whole. This is the answer. This has always been the answer. I have known what you are since I was 10 years old. I did not marry the Duke everyone fears. I married the man who broke the ice with his bare hands. It was never once in my life possible to fear you. The paper made a sound, and Julian realized it was shaking in his grip. And then Mrs. Fletcher was somehow beside him with her hand on his shoulder. A liberty of 30 years' service, never once taken until now, and the old housekeeper was weeping and speaking, and what she was saying penetrated only slowly. Then it's true, she was saying. God forgive us all, it's true, it's written down, Your Grace, I must speak. I should have spoken 15 years ago. She pressed her apron to her mouth, steadied herself, and stood before him like a witness taking an oath. The morning after, that very morning, before the constable ever came, Mr. Victor took me aside. Me and Hobbs the butler and old Marsh from the stables. Separately mined. So kind he was, so grieving. And he explained to each of us, gentle as a rector, what we had seen the night before. That he'd arrived at dawn just ahead of the constable. That anyone who thought they'd glimpsed him earlier had seen the lanterns playing tricks. And Marsh had taken a horse from him at 11 o'clock that night, Your Grace, hours before, and Marsh told me so with his own mouth. And a week later Marsh's cottage had a new roof, and Marsh had a purse, and Marsh had a new memory too. Her voice failed and came back fierce. I said nothing. All these years, you sitting alone in this house with the whole world's back turned to you, and I said nothing, for I'd no proof, only a stableman's word soon bought and my own misgiving. But I'll say it now in any court in England. I'll say it to God on my last day. Victor Thorne was at Ravenhall that night, and lied of it after, and paid to bury it, and I knew, and I am ashamed. Julian stood in the wreckage of 15 years, the report on the desk, the child's testimony in his hand, the housekeeper's confession hanging in the air. And the strange thing, the thing he could never afterward explain, was that what he felt first was not rage. The rage came, and it came like weather. But first, For one clear, weightless moment, what he felt was the ice of 15 winters breaking off him all at once, because somebody knew. Somebody had always known. Somebody had counted his blows against the ice so she would not cry, and had loved him since before she understood the word, and had walked into his monstrous house on her wedding day already certain, and had then gone silent and cold and locked her door and signed the papers and left him. Why? The question detonated. Because Clara Hayward did not break promises lightly and did not frighten easily, and only one thing on this earth had ever made her hands shake. And 3 days ago she had looked up at his study window for 3 seconds as though memorizing his face. And there was only one reason a woman with this page sewn into her Bible would surrender everything it had cost her 15 years to reach. She had not been persuaded to leave. She had been aimed away from him, like a weapon being disarmed. "Where is my cousin?" said the Duke of Ravenhall, and his voice made Betsy step backward into the doorframe. The answer came within the hour, and it came wearing livery. A groom riding hard from Millbrook with the second post, and a message that had been left that morning with elaborate casualness at the Duke's own solicitor's office, addressed in Victor's beautiful hand. A cheerful note, cousinly, regretting the sad news of the annulment, announcing that, the season being done and the county so gloomy, Mr. Thorne had resolved to travel and had given up his Millbrook rooms and might be some time abroad. Wishing his dear cousin at last the peace he deserved. Given up his rooms, gone, untraceable, self-erased, on the very morning that a report from a Millbrook inquiry agent had reached Ravenhall. And Julian understood with the whole of his skin that there was no coincidence in it. Whatever eyes Victor kept in this county had told him about the writer, told him the recalled inquiry had lived after all, told him that 15 years of buried winter was coming up out of the ground. Victor Thorne was not fleeing abroad. Victor Thorne was tidying. And there was, in all the world, exactly one loose thread left for him to cut. One witness. One memory that could not be bought a new roof. One woman, newly annulled, newly unprotected, stripped of the Ravenhall name by her own signature, living quietly, alone but for an old broken doctor, in a house on the edge of Aldenbury that Victor had known the road to for 15 years. Julian was in the stable yard before the groom had finished speaking, throwing the saddle onto the black horse himself, his scarred hands sure and terrible on the girth, and Mrs. Fletcher ran out into the yard after him with her cap coming loose, crying out the only thing there was left to ask. "Your Grace, where?" "Aldenbury," said the Duke everyone feared, and the iron gates of Ravenhall opened for the 3rd time in 15 years, and he went through them at the gallop, racing the dusk, racing the road, racing a smiling golden man with a 15-year head start, toward the only person who had ever seen the truth by moonlight, and who did not know, as she lit the evening lamp in her father's quiet house, that both of them were coming. The knock on the door of the doctor's house in Aldenbury came at 7:30, just as the last light was dying out of the sky. Clara was in the kitchen, warming broth for her father, who had taken to his bed at sundown as he did most days now. A gray, diminished man who had wept when she arrived on Saturday, wept without asking a single question, as though he had always known that whatever he had buried 15 years ago would one day come home in a gray traveling cloak. She heard the knock and she knew. It is a strange thing, but she was not surprised, and afterward she understood why. Some part of her had been waiting for this knock since she was 10 years old. She had signed the papers to keep Julian safe, and in her exhaustion she had let herself believe that surrender would purchase peace. But standing in the kitchen with the ladle in her hand, hearing that warm, patient, sociable knock, a knock that said a friendly caller, nothing to fear, opened the door, she saw the whole truth of her situation with terrible clarity. She had made herself worthless to Victor as a duchess, which meant she was now worth even less to him as a witness. Clara looked once around the kitchen, at the door to the hall, at the door to her father's old examination room, dark and unused, standing ajar beside the parlor, at the window, too small, at the lane outside, empty for a mile in either direction. Then she wiped her hands and untied her apron and did the arithmetic of her life in 4 seconds, and the answer was this: she could not outrun him, could not outfight him, and could not outweight him. There was exactly one thing in this world she could do better than Victor Thorne, one thing she had proven across 15 years and he had never learned at all. She could keep still while everything screamed. The knock came again, gentler, so kind, so patient. Clara, her father's voice, thin, frightened, from the top of the stairs. He had heard it too, and he knew that knock the way she knew it from 15 years of nightmares. Clara went to the foot of the stairs and looked up at her father, and what she said, low and fast, was not a comfort but an instruction. And it was, though Victor Thorne standing outside in the dusk could never have imagined it, the beginning of a counterattack. "Papa, listen to me and do exactly this. Go down the back stair quietly now. Cross the garden to Mrs. Prout's and send her boy running for Sir Henry Marle, the magistrate. Papa, Sir Henry, no one else. Tell him the Duchess of Ravenhall says come at once, and come quietly to the back of the house, to the garden door of your examination room, and listen before he enters. Say those words. Listen before he enters. Go, now." "Clara, who is at the door?" "Papa." She took his cold hands. Downstairs, the knock came a third time, and now a warm voice floated through the door, calling her name like an old friend. "For 15 years you kept a secret to protect me. Tonight I need 1 hour to end it. Go." And something moved in the broken old doctor's face, some last unspent coin of the man he had been. And he went, quick and silent, down the back stair, out into the dark garden, running for the first time in a decade. Clara stood alone in the hall. She pressed her hands together until they stopped shaking. Then she opened the examination room door wide to the dark, the room with its heavy curtain across the alcove where patients had once undressed, its garden door, its walls that carried sound from the parlor through the old connecting vent her father had cursed for 30 years. And she arranged the geography of the next hour in her mind like a chess board. Then she went to the front door and opened it, and said, in a voice of flat, beaten weariness that was the finest performance of her life, "Mr. Thorne, of course it's you." Victor Thorne stood on the step in the last of the light, golden and gentle, hat in hand, his face composed into beautiful sorrow, and behind him the lane was empty, and his carriage, she noted it and filed it, was nowhere in sight. He had walked. From wherever he had left it, he had walked, so that no coachman could say where he had spent this evening. "Your Grace," he said softly, "though forgive me, we must accustom ourselves, Miss Hayward, now. May I come in? I heard the sad news, and I find myself," he sighed, warmly, "unable to leave England without expressing my sympathy. And my gratitude. You did the wise thing, the safe thing. I confess I worried you wouldn't." "You've come to make certain of me," Clara said dully. "Come in then. There is no one here. My father is asleep upstairs. He sleeps like the dead now. You may say whatever you came to say." She turned her back on him, every nerve in her body shrieking at the turning of it, and walked into the parlor, and heard him follow, and heard the front door close behind him with a small, deliberate, final click. What followed was the longest hour of Clara Hayward's life, and she played it like an instrument. She gave him tea because tea meant time. She let her hands tremble carrying the tray because her fear soothed him, fed him, made him expansive. She sat small and defeated in her father's chair and let Victor Thorne fill the room with his warmth and his triumph. And she discovered what she had gambled everything on discovering, that a man who has carried a masterpiece in silence for 15 years, who has been magnificent for 15 years with no audience but himself, wants one thing more than safety. He wants, just once, before he buries the last witness to be seen. You understand, I hope, that none of it was personal, he said, somewhere in the second cup. Not the marriage business, not any of it. I bear you no malice at all. You have been the most worthy opponent of my life, and I include my late cousin Edmund in that reckoning. He smiled and shook his golden head fondly. 15 years and one sleeping child in a gig. The one variable I never counted. Do you know, when I finally placed your face, I almost laughed. All the great families of England spent 15 years failing to touch me, and the danger the whole time was a doctor's daughter counting in the dark. I saw you push him, Clara said quietly. It was not an accusation. She made it a tribute. She laid it before him like a mirror, and Victor Thorne looked into it and could not look away. Did you, all of it? He leaned forward, genuinely, hungrily curious. The quarrel too? I heard shouting, money, papers. He turned his back on you. He laughed at me. And there it was, the crack in the gold, 15 years wide. Victor set down his cup, and his voice, for the first time since she had known him, lost its music. I came to him that night ruined. Ruined, do you understand? The debts had teeth by then, the kind of men who take payment out of your skin. I asked Edmund for help, not a gift, a rescue between brothers in all but name. And he refused me on the ice in the cold, with Julian trailing us like a dog, and when I pressed him, when I begged him, and I have never begged another living creature, he laughed, and said the estate was not a gaming purse, and turned his back. Victor's hands on his knees had curled. So no, Miss Hayward, I did not plan it. I am not a planner of murders. I am an improviser of exceptional gifts. The ice did the work. I merely declined to interfere with nature. And then I stood in that boathouse and watched my cousin Julian volunteer, scream by scream, to become the story that would keep me safe forever. He built my alibi with his own bleeding hands. All I ever did afterward was decline to correct people. He exhaled, and the music came back into his voice, and he smiled at her, luminous and light. 15 years, and it has been flawless. And you are the only person on God's earth to whom I will ever say those words aloud, because in an hour, regrettably, you will be beyond repeating them. The parlor clock ticked. Clara Hayward sat very still in her father's chair, 3 feet from a man announcing her death, and inside the wave of terror there rose, absurd and enormous, a single ringing note of triumph, because the connecting vent to the dark examination room stood open behind her chair, and for the last 10 minutes she had heard it, the faintest shift of a boot on a floorboard, the breath of the garden door. The dark examination room had not been empty. An accident, of course, Victor was saying gently, standing, drawing off his gloves. A lamp, a curtain, an old dry house, grief-stricken woman, cast-off wife, careless with fire. The county will sigh and pity in. Sir Henry, said Clara Hayward in a clear, carrying voice, have you heard enough? And the examination room door opened. Sir Henry Marle, magistrate of the county for 22 years, came through it first, gray-faced, with the doctor behind him, and behind them, filling the garden doorway with mud to his thighs and murder in his face, having ridden one horse half to death and heard, from the dark of that little room, every word from the ice quarrel onward, came the Duke of Ravenhall. What happened in the next 30 seconds, Clara could never afterward fully order in her memory. Victor moving fast, unbelievably fast, toward her, because an improviser of exceptional gifts understands hostages, and never arriving, because Julian crossed the parlor like weather, like the falling of a tree, and what the Duke everyone feared did to his golden cousin took 4 seconds and left Victor Thorne on the floor against the wainscot, discovering, at long last, what the county had merely rumored. What those scarred hands were actually capable of when their owner stopped declining to use them. That will do, your grace, said Sir Henry quietly, and it very nearly did not. They took Victor Thorne away in the magistrate's own carriage, wrists bound, golden head bowed, though at the door he paused and turned and looked at Clara and said, with a smile from which everything had drained except a kind of wondering, professional respect. A sleeping child in a gig. 15 years. Do you know, I never once lost until tonight, and I find I cannot even resent the instrument. Then the door closed on him forever. The confession, spoken freely before a magistrate and 3 witnesses, did in one evening what 15 years had refused to do. Sir Henry took Clara's written testimony, both pages, the child's and the woman's, and Mrs. Fletcher's statement followed within the week, and old Marsh the stableman, called upon at last, wept and gave up his bought memory like a splinter coming out of a wound. By spring assizes it was done. Victor Thorne, convicted on his own vanity, transported for life. And through every drawing room in England there ran, like fire through stubble, the correction of a 15-year-old story. And society, which had feasted so long on the monster of Ravenhall, discovered its appetite for the truth was even greater, because the truth was better. The wronged brother, the bleeding hands, the child witness, the Bible with the testimony sewn into its spine. But all of that came after. That night there was only the parlor and the guttering lamp, and 2 people standing amid the wreckage of a tea service with 15 years and 1 annulment between them. The doctor had gone up with Sir Henry to give his statement. The room was suddenly, ringingly quiet. Julian stood by the door, mud-ruined, hollow-eyed, and now that there was no one left to fight, all his terrible speed was gone. He looked at her and could not seem to come a step closer, like a man at the edge of ice he does not trust. "I read it," he said finally. His voice was wrecked. "The Bible, Betsy found it. Clara, the stitches, you sewed it in when you were 10 years old." 11, she said. "The stitching took me a while. I was better at watching than sewing." He made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and failed and became something else. "You counted," he said, "the blows on the ice, so you would not cry. I was 17 and I thought I was alone in the universe, and 40 feet away in the dark there was a child counting so she would not cry over me." He looked down at his scarred hands, turned them over as if seeing them at last from the outside, from the lake road, by moonlight. "Everyone saw a murderer that night. Everyone. For 15 years, everyone." "No," Clara said. "Everyone heard about a murderer. That is different. I am the only one who saw, and I will tell you what I saw." She crossed the parlor to him. He still could not move, and took his ruined hands in both of hers, the way she had in the chapel, and looked up at him, and gave him, at last, whole and unlocked, the answer to the question he had asked through her door on their wedding night. "I saw a man throw himself into black water for his brother, knowing he could not win. I saw him go under and choose to come up and go under again. I saw him fight the ice with his bare hands until his own blood was on the moonlight, and fight the men who saved him, because being saved meant stopping. That is what I have known about you since I was 10 years old, Julian. That is the man I married. So when you ask me why I was never afraid of you, I did not fear the Duke everyone feared, because I met you before he existed. I am the only person alive who knew you first." Julian Thorne stood holding his wife's hands in the lamplight, and it must be recorded that the Duke of Ravenhall, terror of the county, wept, and did not hide it, and the words came out of him in pieces. 15 years only you believed, no, only you knew. And I, his hands tightened on hers, I had you. I had the one soul on this earth who knew me innocent under my own roof, wearing my ring. And it took Victor 3 weeks to show me a shape in the dusk, and I condemned you in an evening, on sight, without a question. Everything the world did to me, I turned and did to you, and then I sent you the papers, and then I let you drive out through those gates." He stopped and steadied and said it plainly, like a man at his own sentencing. "You watched them all misjudge me for 15 years and never once joined them. I could not return the favor for one winter. Whatever was monstrous at Ravenhall, Clara, it was never behind my face. It was behind my fear. I am done with it. If you tell me to go, I will go. But I am asking, Julian, I am asking whether a thing signed in despair can be unsigned in." "Julian," Clara reached up and stopped his mouth with her fingers, and she was laughing now and crying both at once, and neither one was hidden. You galloped a horse to death's door and stood in a dark closet for an hour to save my life. You may assume the papers are negotiable. And so it was that Mrs. Prout's boy, returning late past the doctor's window with the magistrate's shilling hot in his pocket, glanced in at the lamplight and saw a sight he would recount in the Aldenbury taproom for the next 50 years, and be called a liar every time. The Duke of Ravenhall, the Duke everyone feared, on his knees on a parlor floor with his face buried in a woman's hands, and the woman bending over his dark head, unafraid, unafraid, unafraid. 2 years later, on a bright afternoon in June, the iron gates of Ravenhall stood wide open, as they now stood every day, because the Duchess had ordered the locks taken off, and the Duke had discovered he could refuse his wife nothing, and the whole county knew both of these facts and found them equally wonderful. It was the day of the summer fair, an invention of her Grace's, now in its 2nd year. The great lawns were covered with trestle tables and bunting. Tenants and villagers wandered the gardens that had been closed to the world for a generation. There were races for the children and cider for the farmers, and the West Stairs maids, who sang all year round now, and were considered the authority on all matters concerning the family, moved through the crowd with trays and gossip in equal measure. By the rose garden, a long table had been laid for the wedding party, because the fête this year had swallowed a wedding into itself. Betsy, the Duchess's own maid, had that morning married a young farmer with good land and better manners, and the Duke of Ravenhall had given the bride away himself. A sentence that would have caused fainting fits in any drawing-room in England 3 years earlier, and today caused only cheering. Dr. Hayward sat in the shade with a rug over his knees despite the warmth, older and frailer, but with something restored in his face that no medicine had put there. He had testified at the assizes with a steady voice. He had wept afterward for a week. And he had spent the 2 years since being slowly, patiently forgiven by the 2 people whose forgiveness he had believed impossible, learning, as Clara told him on the day the verdict came, that a secret kept in fear for 15 years weighed less than he thought. Once it was set against a small girl brought along in a gig on a winter night, without whom the truth would have died on that ice entirely. And through the middle of it all walked the Duke of Ravenhall, with his daughter on his arm. She was 1 year old, and she was carried rather than walking, and she had her mother's brown eyes and her father's dark hair and the undivided, unconditional, abject devotion of 40 servants, 400 tenants, and 1 duke. Julian carried her everywhere. He carried her now between the trestle tables, gravely introducing her to farmers' wives, and the small girl surveyed her domain from the height of her father's arms and shrieked with laughter at nothing, and the man who had once silenced rooms by entering them laughed back. His hands people noticed, because people always noticed his hands now, though for entirely new reasons, were bare. He had not worn gloves in 2 years. The scars showed white in the summer sun, and in the village they had become a kind of legend told to children at bedtime. The marks of the night the good Duke fought the ice for his brother. Children in Aldenbury played the story on the mill pond every winter, fighting over who would be the Duke. Nobody ever wanted to be the Gold Man. Of the Gold Man himself, the county spoke rarely. Victor Thorne was on the other side of the world, in a place where charm bought very little, and the last that was heard of him was a single letter he had written to no one in particular, confiscated by the authorities, which was said to have contained only a rambling, professional analysis of the one mistake of his career. He had made an error of arithmetic, he wrote. He had counted every witness. He had simply never conceived that a sleeping child might be one. At the wedding table in the golden slant of the late afternoon, Betsy's new husband's youngest sister, 17, visiting from 2 counties away, and drunk on nothing but the summer and the spectacle, found herself seated beside the Duchess of Ravenhall herself. The girl had been working up her courage through 3 helpings of cake. Finally, In the lull while the toasts were being prepared, she leaned in close, cheeks scarlet, and whispered the question. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I have to ask or I shall burst. Before you married him, when they made you marry him, they say everyone was afraid of the Duke, the priest, your own father, everyone in the church. Were you truly not frightened, not even a little, not even at the very beginning?" Clara looked down the table. Her husband was standing at the far end with their daughter asleep against his shoulder, one scarred hand spread across her small back, listening to her father, the doctor, tell a story. As if he felt his wife's eyes, he always felt them. It remained the talk of the servants' hall. Julian looked up, found her instantly across all that distance and all those people, and gave her the smile that belonged to no one else. The one that had taken 15 years, one storm, one chapel fire, and one unlocked door to bring back into the world. "Frightened," Clara said. "No, not even at the very beginning." "But how?" the girl pressed, awed. "Everyone was, everyone. How could you be the only one?" And the Duchess of Ravenhall smiled, and gave the only answer there had ever been. "Because everyone else had heard the story, my dear," she said. "I was the only one who had seen the truth." The toasts were called. The glasses went up. The sun went down slow and golden over Ravenhall, over the open gates and the crowded lawns and the small girl asleep on her father's shoulder, over the house where the Duke everyone feared lived happily, loudly, and entirely unfeared ever after. For they had forced her to marry the Duke everyone feared. She was the only one who did not fear him, and for one long winter it nearly broke his heart that he could not understand why. Now he understood. She had never once been brave. She had simply all along been right. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.